Dear colleagues, good morning for those who are in Moscow, and Professor Tisa, hello. We understand that it's already midnight in California, and a special thanks for you not only for accepting our invitation, but also for taking this time for being with us with your presentation at the 22nd Annual April Conference at the Higher School of Economics. Let me say a few words which probably are not needed today in this particular session, because for everyone engaged in research in business and economics, the name of Professor Tisa is very well known. I would only remind that David was recognized in 2020 as the most cited scholar worldwide in the business and management field, especially for his contributions to strategic management theory. Let me also say that on the cover slide of his presentation today, we can see quite a number of affiliations that David decided to put on this cover slide. And this trio of logos that we will see there really symbolizes a very unique nature of David as a scholar, as a great teacher, but also as a professor who, in his wording, spends half of his time in the real world, which is really critical for the one who studies real management problems and tries to bring advanced management and economics theory and social sciences theories for understanding the most actual trends in management field. We will see there the logos not only of Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley, where David is professor for, I guess, already almost 40 years, but also the logos of BRG, which is a Berkeley research group, one of the top expert consulting firms, which David started about 10 years ago, and now it has $700 million annual turnover, 1,400 experts on board, and also it's the Berkeley Executive Institute mentioned on this slide, because developing executives at top corporations is one of the fields where David has also great contributions. I would also mention and just remind that David started about 20 years ago Industry and Corporate Change journal, which is now one of the top international journals in the field of strategic management. Without any further delay, let me welcome Professor David Tisa to our April conference this year. Thank you, David, very, very much for being with us, and the floor is yours. Let me only finalize my introduction with a few organizational remarks for our session. David has a presentation which he expects will last for about 1 hour and a half, and then we will have 30 minutes question and answer sessions. We are working through 2 channels on Microsoft Teams and through YouTube. Right now we have already more than 100 colleagues, professors and doctoral students who are there in these 2 channels with us right now. And I ask you to start sending questions in written form in YouTube, and then of course we will ask a few people who will raise their hands from Microsoft Teams during Q&A session also to ask their questions, which I will moderate. David, the floor is yours. We are eager to hear your presentation on dynamic capabilities and related paradigms.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and it's a delight to be talking to you today. And as Valerie pointed out, I've split my time between academic research and practice. And what happens when you're in practice, one finds that there's gaps in economic theory and in management theory. And so what I've had to do as of necessity is to try and fill those gaps. And that's what led me to create this framework that I call dynamic capabilities. And it's really quite amazing when you think about it that the field of economics has not come up with a theory of capabilities until now. And likewise for the theory of management, there's very little about capabilities, and in particular about dynamic capabilities. And what I've been searching for is a framework that can understand and help me understand and others understand how firms build and sustain competitive advantage. How do you get ahead and stay ahead through superior management? And that's really what this framework is about. And my exploration has been very much informed by where I live here in Berkeley on the edge of Silicon Valley and observing Silicon Valley firms that are very innovative and very agile and very entrepreneurial. So that's the background. And now it's my pleasure to give you an introduction to this framework. Next slide, please. I'll first give you some background factors. What is it about the business environment that requires a new approach? I'll then outline the dynamic capabilities framework. I'll then try and make it really practical by looking at what executives say, even though they don't use the precise vocabulary that I use. They speak in a manner that is consistent with the framework. And then I want to try and integrate the work of other scholars who have created similar paradigms, but in my view, they're not sufficiently all-encompassing. I'm going to present to you that dynamic capabilities is the, if you will, the macro or meta framework that can help pull together many good ideas that other folks have developed, other research that's going on in management and in economics. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk first about background factors. Next slide, please. One of the things that you're probably aware of, and it's becoming very clear in the American economy, and I think in Europe as well, and in China, is that some firms are sort of getting out ahead and staying out ahead, and that the gap between the best performers, between the top performers and the bottom performers, between the top quartile and the bottom quartile is getting larger. This has been apparent for some time, and if I continued this chart on, and the data is there to do it, particularly with the pandemic, this is getting even further apart. So there are some firms that are doing well and others that are struggling. And the question is why? And is there something about management that may have something to do with it? Is it just about technology, or is it also about management? And I submit to you, it's got as much to do with management as it has to do with technology. Next slide, please. And you see that the largest firms are no longer always profitable. There used to be a time period when we thought that being big and having large market share mattered. That's not so clear anymore. So this is telling us that a lot of standard ways that the textbook frames this issue and attempts to explain business success have to be rethought. And that's what I've done with the dynamic capabilities framework. Next slide, please. One of the most important things to understand, and I say this to not just practitioners, but also to my economist friends, is to understand the difference between managing risk and managing uncertainty. You know, economics talks about uncertainty, but in fact, when you look at what most economists do when they're trying to take into account uncertainty, they're looking at risk. Risk is something where you can put a probability on a certain event. In other words, you know that there's a certain risk of a hurricane, or you know that there's a certain risk of a business recession, or you know that there's a certain risk that a company will fail. And you can put a probability on it. And of course, if that's true, you can take all kinds of hedging strategies and insurance and all kinds of things, standard things that you can do to manage through risk. In fact, banks have big risk management departments. But in fact, it's not risk that we have to worry about. That's relatively easy to handle. It's uncertainty. Next slide, please. And the economist Frank Knight made this distinction very clear, almost 100 years ago, to be precise, that there are some futures we know. And in this diagram, I've got F1, F2, F3, F4. These are sort of potential futures of the world that you know about. But then there's a whole bunch of other futures that we don't know anything about. They are what some people refer to as the unknown unknowns. And what I submit to you is that most of our management theories and most of our economic theories don't know what to do with unknown unknowns. But managers are confronted every day with unknown unknowns. And in fact, as the global system changes, we're getting more and more of them. The frequency of unknown unknowns, or what in finance theory is sometimes referred to as black swans because they're not expected. The frequency of these events and these scenarios is amplifying, in part because the world is interdependent. We're not insulated from each other. So globalization, one of the knock-on effects, or one of the consequences of globalization is actually greater uncertainty. And we have to revise our theories to take that into account. And I submit that most of us in the academic world have been pretty slow in doing so, in part because it's much harder to model uncertainty than it is to model risk. But that shouldn't be the excuse. That should be the challenge that we respond to. Next slide, please. Just look at indexes of business uncertainty. What you see is increasing volatility. And of course, with COVID, this has gone through the roof, so to speak. So no matter how you think about measuring uncertainty, and it's very hard to measure, I should point out, but when people don't know what's coming next, when they are uncertain about where key variables are going to be and what the challenges and opportunities are they're going to face, that's increased business uncertainty. Next slide, please. And part of this is driven by policy uncertainty. Political systems are no longer as predictable, so it seems. And because of that, we have policy uncertainty coupled with technological uncertainty, coupled also with uncertainty of the physical environment because of climate change and related things. So this is a very different environment in which managers must manage. And I say managers, I'm thinking primarily of private sector managers, but the framework, I would argue, also applies to the public sector, although I really haven't worked it out very clearly and with much detail with respect to the public sector. But I do think a lot of the basic propositions I'm going to present to you are applicable in the public sector as well as the private sector. Next slide, please. So let's dig into the framework. What is this dynamic capabilities framework all about? Next slide, please. Well, please fill in the rest of this slide for me. It's partly about a mental model. And, the mental model on the left is the way firms used to think about competing, which is the more resources you had, the more capital you had, the greater the likelihood of prevailing. So the military has been thinking about these things for a long time. The new approach, of course, is it's not about the resources you have. It's not about the number of this, the number of that. It's not about your balance sheet issues. It's not about tangible assets. It's about how you coordinate the assets that you have. It's about how you deploy the assets that you have. It's about sensing what's coming next so that you can address changing threats and opportunities. So it's a recognition that soft assets are really critical for business success. If you think about business companies, it's not about what's on the balance sheet as much as what's not on the balance sheet. And the way in which you orchestrate these assets is critically important. So, you know, dynamic capabilities is, in a way, something I'm sure people in the military, whether it's yours or ours, have thought about for many years. But it's not something that's infected management thinking until now. And that's what I'm going to try and develop for you. It's a new mental model about what's important for business success long term. Next slide, please. So let's think about yesterday's world and today's world. Yesterday's world, I call the conventional concept. And quite frankly, it's kind of what our textbook knowledge has been focused on. Textbook knowledge in management and in economics has been focused on the industrial world, where you didn't so much look at risk, at uncertainty as risk. Competition you saw as taking place between firms that were relatively the same, and they competed on price. Competition came from cutting price and doing things a little better or a little cheaper, but innovation was not key. Arrogantly, in the West, we thought it was just us and nobody else mattered. Analysis was done at the industry level. Firms were more or less the same. Innovation was thought of as one little thing rather than many things together. And vertical integration and in-house R&D was the way that innovation was run, and resources were critical. That's sort of the variables that, quite frankly, 90% of the textbooks focus on them. But the new world, the 21st century, what I call the next generation concepts, are one where you have to think about an economy and business firms facing deep uncertainty. Competition is driven by technology. I call that dynamic competition. So all of our traditional ways of thinking about competition are somewhat modified. The world may not be fully globalized, but at least it's semi-globalized. Industries don't matter very much. I don't know what an industry is anymore, if I ever did. You look at Disney, look at Netflix, look at Amazon competing with Disney and competing with Hollywood. Industry boundaries don't matter. Big data matters. Ecosystems matter. Firms are heterogeneous. Innovation, you know, the iPhone uses something like, 100,000 plus patented technologies. It's not one product, one patent, or one patent for one product. It's a global system of invention and innovation that results in new products. So it's a multi-invention world with global networks and where capabilities rather than resources are critical. So that's the new world that's been around actually for quite a while, but nobody's really focused very much on what it all means. Next slide, please. Sorry, I hear an intervention.
No,
Okay.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you. So let's focus not on the social sciences and not on economics. Let's focus on strategic management, which is a subfield of management that really integrates a lot of other elements of management. And some of you, no doubt, in fact, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work of my friend and colleague, Michael Porter at Harvard, because his textbook on competitive advantage and his 5 forces approach for the last 30 years has really sort of dominated management thinking and certainly business education. But it's industry level analysis. It's focused on that industrial world of yesterday. It's very static. Innovation isn't front and center. There's no mention of ecosystems. There is very little mention of economies of scope. It's all about scale, and it's all about learning to some extent, yes, but it's about what I call the world of static competition. And that, reasonably accurately characterized the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and maybe into the 70s. But that world's long gone, but the textbooks have not really changed very much. Then following Porter's industry level analysis with his critical 5 forces, younger scholars started talking about a resource-based approach. The basic notion here is that really value at the enterprise level comes not from picking the right industry, not from positioning behind entry barriers, but by accumulating valuable, difficult to imitate resources of one kind or another. And it's a very sort of Ricardian view, if you will, where and that makes some sense that really what you want to own is the scarce resources that are necessary to compete. Problem with the resource-based approach, it doesn't tell you where those scarce resources come from. But of course, they come in the main from innovation. And what's scarce today may be unscarce tomorrow. What is ubiquitous today may be scarce the day after. So you need to put that framework or make that framework dynamic. You need to not just take a snapshot of the world and analyze the world as if it's static, as the resource-based approach does. You need to make it dynamic. And that's why I found it helpful to develop this framework called dynamic capabilities. And in this world, of course, competition is very disruptive. It's driven by innovation. And the firms that are successful are the ones that can sense what's coming next, that can perhaps shape the environment, that can orchestrate the assets that are necessary and drive towards competitive advantage, reshaping ecosystems and transforming. So figuring out how to restructure and do so in a timely way and in a meaningful way. And that may mean, creating new organizations. It may mean changing the organizational culture. There's lots of things that management scholars have talked about that fit into this framework, but no one's pulled it together in a semi-coherent way. And that's what I try and do in the dynamic capabilities framework. Next slide, please. So the fundamental question, so one should always ask when you have a framework, what's the problem you're trying to answer? What's the question you're trying to answer? And the fundamental question that I'm trying to answer is, I would argue, the most fundamental question in all of business, which is, how do you build and sustain competitive advantage? If you're able to do that, you'll get better than average profits over the long run. You'll be able to survive not just for years, but for decades and maybe for centuries. So if you've got strong dynamic capabilities, I'm going to argue, you've got to have, let me put it differently, in order to maintain competitive advantage long term, you're going to need this capability that I call dynamic capabilities. So we recognize that competitive advantage is fleeting. Very few firms stay in the top for very long. So it's obviously something that's quite hard to do. So first of all, here on this slide, I actually define for the first time what dynamic capabilities are. And I say it's the ability of an organization and its management to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competences to address rapidly changing environments. So it's a capability that's not just about doing things inside the organization, it's about doing things with other organizations. And it's about integration. It's about building capabilities you don't have. It's about reconfiguring the things that you do have. It's about reshaping, constantly reshaping the basic capabilities of an enterprise in order for it to be fit for the future. Next slide, please. Now, I talked about dynamic capabilities. I began this thinking about this and writing about it in the 90s. And it took me 20 years of looking at blank faces to realize that I had to explain not just what dynamic capabilities are, but what they're not. And some of my colleagues, Sydney Winter, Connie Helfat, and others were ahead of me on this and talking about ordinary capabilities or operating capabilities. And of course, most of what's in the textbooks in economics is about exactly this. It's about using resources efficiently. But the story behind dynamic capabilities is that efficiency doesn't deserve the priority it's given. Yes, from time to time you have to be efficient, but in a changing world, efficiency can also be an enemy. So I found it necessary to talk about ordinary capabilities. And I'm not saying that ordinary capabilities don't matter. They do. But they're not going to be the basis of long-term competitive advantage. You can be the most efficient firm, but unless you figure out how to stay efficient as the environment changes, you're going to be out of business. So what are ordinary capabilities? They're about having good standard operating procedures. They're about technical efficiency. They're in fact about best practices. But you know, best practices sound good, but it's not enough. And the reason is because, you know, by the time everybody has best practices, you're beaten down in competitive markets to the point where you're making razor-thin margins. So if you get to best practice, you'll stay alive, but you won't thrive. And that's because of competition. Of course, if you're in an environment where you've got a government monopoly, this doesn't matter. But if you're competing in the global economy and you don't have protection from government, then ordinary capabilities won't get you very far because your rivals will get them too. You can often get them from the public domain. You can go to business schools and get that kind of training. Management consultants will bring you best practice. So I don't want to trivialize it because, in fact, not everybody gets the simple stuff right. And, but the point is, it's a relatively low bar to get the simple stuff right. It's a much higher bar to get dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. Here is the problem, if I can use something from an English fairy tale by the famous author Lewis Carroll, where Alice in Wonderland is talking about the Red Queen. And this character, through the looking glass, she runs faster and faster in order to keep still where she is. That is what happens if all you've got is strong ordinary capabilities. You'll run faster and faster and you'll stand still. You may get a living and maybe you can pay some low level of wages, but you're not going to be able to support high productivity. You're not going to be able to support high wages, and you're not going to be able to support high growth. But you can stay in business, possibly, but it's not exciting. It's one where you work harder and harder every day, but you're not getting ahead. Next slide, please. So that's simply saying, if you apply this to firms, that some firms learn and sometimes advance, but others just copy, imitate, emulate, and take the advantage away. So learning does not lead to a competitive advantage because imitation is so relatively easy today. So with globalization and with the speed of information flow, best practice gets around pretty fast. And I'm not saying that best practice is everywhere in the world. And best practice is something to get started with, but it's not something to finish with. You won't get to greatness by just pursuing best practices. Next slide, please. In fact, I'll go a little bit further and say that sometimes you can get awfully comfortable once you get to having best practices because you may be best at the wrong things. So best practices don't tell you anything about what the object of the exercise is. It just simply says, I'm going to make sure I do this in the best way possible. But the question is, what is the this that you're doing? Are you focusing on the right things? So my point simply is that being a top performer in productivity is unlikely to lead to competitive advantage. Being a top performer with respect to best practices can in fact lull you or deceive you into thinking that you're great when in fact you're not. So I'm not saying that best practices should be forgotten about. Just putting up a word of caution that they can be, if you're not careful, they can be the enemy of innovation. So innovation, of course, is key to dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. So even Edward Deming, Edward Deming is the father of the quality movement. He's American from, was it NYU or Columbia, I forget which, and the Japanese adopted, and Toyota adopted many of the practices and many of the methods of Deming. And so he was the ultimate in sort of pushing best practices and measurement and so forth. And yet, when you read Deming carefully, he says, he who would run his business with visible figures alone will soon have neither a business nor visible figures to work with. So this is from a warning from, if you will, the guru of metrics-based management, the guru of measuring quality. He recognizes that it has to be more than just quality. There has to be more than efficiency. Of course, that more has got a lot to do with innovation. Next slide, please. So the automobile industry, for instance, the technology for making cars, internal combustion cars, is kind of pretty much well spread, not just the United States, not just Europe. There's plants in Russia that are best practice or close there too. And now, of course, in China, everyone's got best practice. But that nobody's making much money in the automobile industry except those like Tesla, who have broken out and dramatically innovating. And here's a quote from Bob Lutz, former vice chairman of General Motors. He happens to be a graduate of the Haas School of Business, so that's one reason why I'm fond of quoting him. But he says the obvious, where the real work of making a car company successful suddenly turns complex, and where the winners are separated from the losers, is in the long cycle product development process, where short-term day-to-day metrics and tabulation of results are meaningless. Nothing could be truer as we think about autonomous cars, and we think about innovation coming not from the incumbent industries, the incumbent firms in the industry, not from the General Motors, not so much from the Toyotas, not so much from the Mercedes-Benz, but from a whole new group of companies. And it could well be Apple or Google that, when it comes to autonomous cars, ends up being, in fact, the leaders. So you have this phenomena now of what I call broad spectrum competition. Industry boundaries are not particularly meaningful because building the platform, the thing that's got the wheels on it, the drivetrain, particularly going to electric, is relatively easy. It's a commodity product. The point of difference, the way you're going to be great is through the software and through integrating all the various technologies that are necessary for autonomous vehicles. And a car is becoming more like a computer than it is the automobile of the past. So a whole new bunch of players are going to show up. And dynamic capabilities here requires you to figure out, well, where do you want to be in this industry? And how are the incumbents going to be able to compete? Along with how do the new companies tackle this space. Dynamic capabilities and figuring out what Lutz is saying, which is, understanding innovation and the trajectory of innovation and participating in it. That's what the game is about. It's got almost nothing to do with efficiency. Next slide, please. Now, folks in the military have understood this for a long time, whether it's the Russian military, the American military. It's not just about dropping bombs. It's not just about, the number of sorties. It's about tying the pieces together. And in fact, military strategists talk about the art of war, and that's the hard part. And if anything, dynamic capabilities, the lessons of dynamic capabilities, I haven't done this work, but I'm quite sure if I looked into military history, I would find plenty of good examples where victory came not from being more efficient at this or that, but from the way that the assets that the forces had were deployed, not just the strategy, but also the organization that went behind it. Next slide, please. So to simplify this framework, and of course, those of you that are academics can go read the, 20 or 30 articles that I've written on dynamic capabilities. But what I've tried to do here in this presentation is get this down to a meaningful cluster of activities or categories that really constitute dynamic capabilities. So I'm now moving into an effort to try and operationalize dynamic capabilities because we want to think about how does this affect the decisions of managers? What should managers do differently in order to stay ahead? And there's three clusters of things. And of course, there's academic literatures on all elements of these, but nobody has pulled them together in a meaningful way. And that's what the framework is about. So the first cluster of things is around sensing and sense making, which is about identifying opportunities and threats at home and abroad, figuring out what's going on in the market, figuring out what's happening demographically, figuring out what's happening in the economy, figuring out where disruption is going to come from, and having a nose for that. And it's not just about, collecting information, it's about understanding emerging trends. And then it's not enough to understand what the future is going to look like. A lot of companies just gaze at the future and don't do anything about it. You then have to seize. And that's really about investment. It's about the mobilization of resources to deliver value and to shape markets. Don't think, as us economists do, that the market is there always and you just fit into the market. No, entrepreneurial companies with strong dynamic capabilities actually shape what markets are. And in fact, they create new markets. So it's all very interdependent. But no point in inventing without commercializing it, which is what the seizing part is about. And then if you're successful, you're going to face new competition, and you've got to be in a process of continuous renewal. And I call that transforming. And whether you're a bank or whether you're a high-tech company, all organizations in dynamic environments with this deep uncertainty have to be transforming. And if you're not good at doing all of these three things more or less simultaneously, you're not going to be able to build and sustain competitive advantage. So let's now dig a little bit more into each one of these things, and I'll try and make them real by using some of the voice of executives. So let's go to the next slide, please. Oops. All right, so let's dig a little bit more into sensing. What does that involve? It means scanning the environment, not just what's happening close in what you think is your industry, but what's happening in other industries. Because as we've seen in today's world, entry from outside an industry is increasingly common. So you've got to be scanning not just in the core of what you're doing, but also on the periphery of what you're doing. But different people can make sense in different ways of what's happening. Like, think of Nokia with mobile phones. They were here in Silicon Valley. In fact, Nokia had a research lab right here in the town of Berkeley. They were spending 5 times as much as a percent of sales on R&D as Apple was, but they didn't figure out the iPhone. Even though they had smartphones, it wasn't internet connected in the same way. So the sense-making part, the need to build an ecosystem was just not there. So just having the antenna up and receiving signals is not enough. You got to figure out what's really going on and what's the opportunities. And that frequently involves building ecosystems, shaping ecosystems, but it also involves good old-fashioned research and development, including open innovation. But it's not just about spending money on R&D. I know as an economist, we all think that innovation comes from spending money on R&D, and it does. And spending money on research and development is important, but it's equally important what you actually spend the R&D money on. In fact, it's more important what you're spending it on rather than the level of expenditure is what's critical. And then, once you sense what's happening, you have to seize it. And that involves, as I said before, investment activities. It may involve changing policies. It may involve restructuring. It will certainly involve creating new business models. Think about Kodak in photography. Along comes digital photography. They were so stuck with making money off of film that they didn't really embrace new digital technology, despite the fact that they invented a lot of it themselves. A lot of early inventions in digital photography were from Kodak, but they lost the plot completely. And then you have to shift or transform, and that involves having the right governance. And sometimes it means you got to fire one CEO and bring in a new person. This is where boards of directors matter. This is where corporate culture matters. This is where vision and mission matter, and all those kinds of things. And the organizational behavior scholars have a lot to tell us about all of those things, but the problem is they never connect it and relate it to the other elements. They don't relate it to strategy. They don't relate it to business, what's going on in the marketplace. And so it's no longer enough to think of these things in silos. CEOs have got to think about all of this stuff at the same time. And not enough of us scholars think about this stuff at the same time. We drill down into these individual silos of knowledge, and we don't bother to put a head up and think about how it relates to what else is happening. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of executive speak, which sort of captures in a strange way, interesting way, the phenomena I'm talking about. So here's Jack Welch, no longer alive, but a former CEO of GE and certainly built a lot of shareholder value at GE. And he says the ability to foresee future opportunities and threats is equivalent to, quote, seeing around corners. Well, of course, we know that we can't quite see around corners. Light travels mainly in straight lines. But he gets the idea across that you've got to not be looking at the world in a linear way. You've got to be thinking about how is COVID, for instance, really going to shape the future marketplace. You've got to be thinking ahead and then acting. So
In the red box there, we point out that sensing activities are the firm's antenna, amplifying weak signals into data streams that are collated for diagnosing, interpreting, and creating a variety of scenarios. In fact, what I'm saying is that scenario planning, which is a tool that's been around for a long time, is a useful way to begin this process of sensing and sense making. When you don't know what's going to happen, at least build some scenarios of what might happen, so that when the uncertainty goes away, you have some chance of already having thought about a potentially relevant scenario. So I'm very much in favor of scenario planning, even though planning as a general matter is not particularly helpful when you have highly dynamic environments. Next slide, please. So crowdsourcing can also help, but the real key, and this is where dynamic capabilities can sort of sync up with the scientific method. The real challenge for managers is to think about hypotheses about what's going on. And, you know, it's not a hypothesis you're going to test in a lab, but these are ideas or hypotheses to carry around in your head. You're never going to get full validation as a manager in terms of what's going on, or by the time you do, it's too late. So you've got to have tentative hypotheses and a number of them in your head at once, and go searching for data and picking up information from whoever you can and getting insights from wherever you can. That's how you get to be good at the sensing and sense making. Next, please. So I've indicated earlier that strong sensing requires investment in R&D and open innovation. Open innovation keeps you very alert to what's happening on the outside. So it's not only a source of new knowledge, it's also a way to benchmark about or against what actually might be going on. So my colleague Henry Chesver at the Haas School has developed this framework that he calls open innovation. And that's another tool, it's another mental model that fits in with dynamic capabilities, particularly with respect to the sensing and sense-making activities. Next slide, please. So what are the logical implications of all of this? What I'm saying is that deductive reasoning isn't going to get you very far, although it's sometimes important. Inductive logic won't get you all the way home either. And there's sort of another concept out there called abductive reasoning, which is neither inductive or deductive, but it allows you to be creative in formulating new hypotheses. You know, in science, we pay so much attention to testing hypotheses without as much attention given to how you generate them. And this is where I think management has something to learn. We need to be really good at creating new scenarios and creating new hypotheses about the way markets are evolving, the way technologies are evolving, so that you can position the firm appropriately. And so I end up by saying abductive reasoning is potentially a handmaiden of sensing. Next slide, please. Then the seizing part. You know, classic examples go back to the 1960s. You know, IBM was literally lost in computing. If you go back to the 50s, you had companies like GE, Westinghouse, Sperry. These were the great names in electronic computing. IBM was nowhere. But in the end, who was it that dominated computing for the next generation? It was IBM. And that's because the founder of IBM, Tom Watson, not only saw the opportunity and understood what computing meant for business and society, but he bet the company on it. He committed the financial capital and the technical resources to develop and deploy the IBM 365 360 system. So, if you will, technologically at the time, it was in last place. It was not the pioneer at all. But he made the investment. IBM made the investment that was necessary. And a similar story happened with the personal computer in the 70s. Xerox developed most of the technology, everything from the GUI interface through to the Ethernet, through to the mouse, to the laser printer. That was all developed at Xerox PARC right here in Palo Alto in the 70s. But the management of Xerox back in Connecticut were distracted with financial issues and mergers and acquisitions, and what the scientific and technological breakthroughs that had been made out here in California were basically ignored. They wouldn't invest behind it. Fortunately, the technology leaked out anyway. Steve Jobs toured the PARC facility. That's where he got the idea for the Apple Macintosh from, and a lot of other key technologies. So it ended up in the market, but Xerox was a loser, or didn't get much benefit from it when it had the future of personal computing in its hand. A failure to seize, a failure to invest behind new technologies. And as I said, Kodak, similar story. Next slide, please. And Apple, let's take Apple today. Well, this is Tim Cook talking about Apple almost a decade ago. But look at what he says. He says, Apple has the ability to innovate in what he calls these three areas: hardware, software, and services. So it's not that they're good at hardware. It's not just that they're good at software. It's not just that they're good at services. But the fact they can do these things simultaneously. And it may sound easy, but it's not. Anytime there is something that's not, governed by best practices, you can't go to a book and say, what are the best practices for integrating hardware, software, and services? There's no formula for that. As he says, it isn't something you can just write a check for. You can't have consultants come in and teach it to you. This is something you build over decades. And that's what makes a distinctive point of difference between Apple and other firms, and the fact they can integrate this and create a better user experience. That's the essence of what Apple is all about. And that's why it has, in my view, a long future ahead of it, so long as it continues to do this. And it's what I call seizing or asset orchestration. This is a key dynamic capability that's central to my framework. Next slide, please. I've also, some of you may know my work on profiting from innovation, where I talk about the business models that are required in order to translate a pioneering advantage in technological development into a marketplace environment. And that involves an understanding of what I call the appropriability regime. Can intellectual property protect what you've got, or do you have to rely on complementary assets, timing, standards, learning curve advantages? There's a whole framework for thinking through this. Now, I can't explain that framework to you here. I don't have the time. But the point is, it's really about the business model that you use to capture value from your invention. So you could be great at figuring out the future. You can have a great new technology, but if you don't figure out how to commercialize it, then you fail. And in fact, what caused me to build this profiting from innovation framework was actually looking at Great Britain, not the industrial area of Great Britain, but the post-World War II Great Britain, where Britain invented, not just nuclear power, but not just hovercraft, but not just magnetic resonance imaging. So many inventions have come out of the UK. But so little of it is being commercialized by enterprises in the UK. And so there's clearly a failure to invest and to seize the entrepreneurial piece, if you will, is not well developed in British industry. The City of London today in financial engineering, I think it's different. I think today, at least in the financial sector, you do see some good examples, not just of sensing the future, but also making the investments to bring new financial services and new financial products to market. So at least in the financial sector, you see strong dynamic capabilities in the UK, but not elsewhere. Next slide, please. And then finally, transforming. This requires leadership and getting the organizational culture right. Any organization that's been around has got to be constantly transforming. And very few firms can do this well. IBM's done it a couple of times. Xerox failed to do it. Transformation is necessary to keep evolutionary fitness. Next slide, please. Just briefly, behind all of this is really a new type of management. We used to think of entrepreneurs as running small companies and managers managing big companies. I believe today, for dynamic capabilities, you need leaders who are entrepreneurial managers. That may sound like a contradiction, but it's not. If you look at the Jeff Bezoses of the world, if you look at the Elon Musk of the world, these people are incredibly entrepreneurial while they're running big companies. They're not letting bureaucracy kill what they do. Next slide, please. So entrepreneurial management plays a key role in developing strong firm level capabilities. I'll move on to the next slide. And my colleague, Charles O'Rayli at Stanford, uses the term ambidexterity to explain the hallmark of management teams with strong dynamic capabilities. So they've got to be able to do two things at once. They've got to be able to bring an entrepreneurial culture and bring new businesses along while at the same time transforming the old ones. So this is like asking an academic to also be a professional. Managers, likewise, it's not just about running the organization, it's about building entrepreneurial new companies alongside, inside, in conjunction with. So to succeed in today's world, you've got to be ambidextrous, and that's particularly true for top management. Just being a bureaucrat and running an organization in autocratic fashion, no longer enough. You've got to figure out how to bring an entrepreneurial flavor and a culture to organizations for them to have strong dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. Needless to say, very few firms have strong dynamic capabilities. And that's also true of Silicon Valley firms. You know, I don't think Intel has got the dynamic capabilities it once had, but I think Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, a lot of the Disney perhaps as well, do have dynamic capabilities, but it's you know, maybe not even the top quartile, maybe the top 10% that have strong dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. So I'll just end this section by saying entrepreneurial leadership matters. And I don't think the leadership literature really stresses enough, if at all, that, you know, managers need to anticipate, they need to interpret, they need to decide, they need to learn, you know, all of these things have to happen. And that's putting a big burden on top management. But needless to say, it's a top management team that can do all of these things, that must be able to do all of these things. It's perhaps too much to expect from one executive, but the team has to act in a cohesive fashion, and it has to be able to do all of this at once. Next slide, please. So this is actually a summary slide of the framework. On the left, I've got ordinary capabilities. This is about technical efficiency. It's about being good at operations, running a tight administration, having good accounting, good governance. The reason why that's necessary but not sufficient is because a lot of companies can do that. And if everybody in an industry can do that, if everybody in an ecosystem can do it, it's about doing things right, but it doesn't buy you a point of difference. It's what's on the right-hand side that can buy you a point of difference. That's the dynamic capabilities. It's about finding and maintaining strategic fitness. It's about sensing, seizing, and shaping. And it's very difficult. So at a very simple level, you can think of dynamic capabilities as being about doing the right things rather than doing things right. I don't know how that translates into Russian, but in English, it's a nice contradiction that I think when you dwell on it, will help you understand the difference between ordinary and dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. Just a word about strategy. I haven't talked too much about strategy, but you must have strategy in order to have strong dynamic capabilities. So you have to figure out how to bring your capabilities and your strategy into alignment. And as Richard Ramelt says, a good strategy is a specific and coherent response to an approach for overcoming the obstacles to progress. So diagnosis is very much like sensing and sense-making. Guiding policy is action-oriented, as is coherent action. So really the way Ramelt thinks about strategy, it's about sensing and seizing in the language of capabilities, of dynamic capabilities. I'll just leave it at that and say that it's not just about getting the organization right, getting the strategy right is a critical dynamic capability as well. Next slide, please. So simple things like these statements from Charles de Gaulle, French general and statesman: you have to be fast on your feet and adaptive, or else a strategy is useless. So he's saying capabilities and agility matter. Strategy alone won't win you a place on the battlefield. And you could also say it the other way around, which is even if you have a great strategy, even if you're fast on your feet, if you don't know where you're going, it's not going to do you any good. Next slide, please. Maybe we'll skip these slides. We'll skip these next few slides. We'll skip this one too. So let's just dwell for a moment on this. Not all business environments are the same. If you're in a sheltered, regulated industry and you're walled off from global competition, you can get by on ordinary capabilities. That's what we try to show here. So in stable environments, the mix of ordinary and dynamic capabilities is different from being in turbulent environments. So when you have high levels of turbulence, which of course is true wherever digital technologies approaching, which is not just the tech sector, things like healthcare, at least in the United States and in Europe, but I imagine in Russia too. Digital technologies are impacting healthcare. So wherever the environment is turbulent, that's where you need strong dynamic capabilities. You know, if you're walled off from globalization, if you're walled off from government, or if you're protected by government regulation, or you have a franchise that's provided by government, then ordinary capabilities will get you by. So I'm not saying everybody needs dynamic capabilities. I'm saying most firms that face vigorous competition need strong dynamic capabilities, and certainly all firms that are competing in global environments need strong dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. My concluding proposition here is that ordinary capabilities are not usually enough to yield sustained competitive advantage. Dynamic capabilities, coupled with a validated strategy, enable an organization to change in a manner that supports evolutionary fitness and sustainable advantage. So there's almost a biological metaphor here. We're saying that dynamic capabilities is necessary for evolutionary fitness, not for profit maximization, because profit maximization won't bring you evolutionary fitness. But if you have evolutionary fitness, you will have strong profitability. Next slide, please. So let me quickly run through. I've got, I think, 23 more minutes left. A few examples from the private sector before we talk about some related paradigms. So next slide, please. I love to read what executives say, because dynamic capabilities is not a word that you use, that you see rolling off the lips of executives. But if you look at what top executives say, they frequently use the language or the concepts that I'm talking about. And here is Indra Nooyi, who, when she took over Pepsi, she said she had a choice. I could have gone pedal to the metal, stripped out costs, delivered strong profits for a few years, and then said adios. What she's saying is, I could have pushed for strong ordinary capabilities. I could have pushed for efficiency, for technical efficiency. And if you put an economist running Pepsi, that's what we as economists are trained to do. But then she says, but that wouldn't have yielded long-term success. So I articulated a strategy to the board focusing on a portfolio we needed to build, the muscles. She even uses a capability type concept, the muscles we needed to strengthen the capabilities to develop. Of course, what she did was she innovated in new products and new foods and changed the whole portfolio of what Pepsi was about. So there you have the juxtaposition in two short paragraphs of ordinary and dynamic capabilities. So thank you, Indra Nooyi, for helping me explain the dynamic capabilities framework and juxtapose it with ordinary. Next, please. But it's not just Pepsi, it's also Coke. And you see Coca-Cola saying innovation will continue to be the source of growth. What they've got to do is accelerate efforts to streamline the beverage portfolio. It's a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning. Not quite as exact language as we had from Pepsi along the dynamic capabilities direction, but very much around innovation, and probably what they're doing is responding to Pepsi. So here we have an industry that we don't think of as a high-tech industry, but nevertheless, because of changing tastes and health issues, you need a lot of experimentation. And you're figuring out what the next big, organic drink is going to be, if that's what people want, is very important. So staying in front involves being able to sense where the market's going and to be able to innovate in order to supply the market with what it needs. That's dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. Of course, Apple is a great example where it completely transformed itself from a computer company to not even an iPhone company. It's an ecosystem-driven company that is providing a whole panoply of services. They've dropped the word computer from their name, and it's now just Apple. And you have a series of new products, but no longer is Apple sort of sticking to iPhones. It's about building an ecosystem. It's about collecting large data sets, and it's about using those large data sets to develop new products. So, an example of very, very strong dynamic capabilities, particularly with Steve Jobs, but also to some extent with Tim Cook. Next slide, please. And then you see companies like Netflix, Amazon Web Services, Disney Plus, these companies turning on a dime. It's not easy to turn a big company on a dime, but with the turbulent environment, that's what you have to do. So Amazon, did not think of itself as a web services company, but it had extra server capacity and tried to figure out, well, how can I deploy that into new opportunities? So taking is a very Penrosian idea, taking an existing set of resources and reconfiguring them for new use. And now you have Disney launching its own streaming service with Disney Plus. These are some old, well-established companies in some cases that are actually making the kind of moves that you would expect to see. And then the whole story of Netflix, the number of times that Netflix has had to pivot, had to change its strategy is breathtaking. They keep doing it, they keep changing, they keep reinventing themselves, almost on an annual basis. That kind of organization is what you need to stay ahead in turbulent environments. Next slide, please. And it's not just American firms. You find a few British, a few European, a few Japanese firms, and many Chinese firms that I think have strong dynamic capabilities too. As Jeremy Derrick says, we don't spend too much time being overly precise. So nothing about, squeezing out the last penny or waiting for uncertainty to resolve itself. They take a wide view. The question is not how we change, but it's not whether we're going to change, but just how we change and at what rate and where. So constantly reconfiguring the organization. Next slide, please. And of course, one of my favorite exemplars of strong dynamic capabilities is Elon Musk and SpaceX. And you see many elements of dynamic capabilities there. You see this ability to combine science, technology, and business. You see the ability to pull all of these pieces together. And that's what's very unusual. This is a great example of asset orchestration, entering the space business and figuring out that a lot of the existing competitors did not have the kind of technologies that was necessary to launch space vehicles cheaply, because at least in the United States, if they exist on government contracts, they're not forced to do things in a commercially cost-effective way. So he had to completely reinvent the launch business, and he did so with success. So there you have a great case of dynamic capabilities, very much led from the top. Next slide, please. And a very clear statement from Steve Jobs about the fact that this is not about being routine. It's very clear here, just picking up in the middle of that paragraph. And there's no secret formula. It says it's ad hoc meetings of 6 people called by someone who thinks he's figured out the coolest new thing ever and who wants to know what other people think about it. It comes from saying no to 1,000 things. So it's about figuring out the future. And when Jobs went to Apple, his success came from shutting down or focusing the company strategy on a narrower set of issues and a narrow set of products. So this ability to combine and be relevant. And there's no cookbook approach to it, is perhaps what Mr. Jobs is telling us here. Next slide, please. And seizing, what are the decision rules? Well, Elon Musk is saying there's no guidebook here. There's no simple math formula to use. So he works everything out from first principles, thinks about problems from the bottom up. I won't go into that. You can read this later. Reasoning from first principles, not putting an NPV threshold or standard tools of finance, not using standard tools of finance, because standard tools of finance no good when you can't forecast future cash flows with any accuracy. What's the use of standard tools of finance? You have to have a different way to make decisions. Next slide, please. And then transforming. Here you have Ken Frazier pointing out the obvious. Big organizations tend to become slow, tend to become bureaucratic, tend to become risk averse. Entrepreneurial managers have to fight those 3 things every day. They have to make organizations less bureaucratic. They have to make them more decisive, faster decision making, and less risk averse. Next slide, please. And this is a Chinese company, Haier. Many of you are probably familiar with it. I think it's the largest white goods producer in the world, but a wonderful story of continuous transformation led by Chairman Zhang. So just simply recommend that you look at the Haier story, and decentralization is a key part of it, but being able to constantly transform the company and make it into a global leader with a sense of urgency and with continuous learning. Next slide, please. Nokia, you know, if you want a great case of transformation, look at Nokia. It started in forest products. You know, we know it, of course, because of its importance in mobile phones, but then it lost the leadership to Apple and Samsung, but now it's pivoted back into network equipment, and it continues to do well. Maybe that transformation's easier when their workforce, you know, is there and it's not going to walk out the door on you as they might in Silicon Valley. But nevertheless, a fantastic story of multiple transformations. You know, IBM, likewise, multiple transformations. Any company that's been around 100 years, you're going to find for sure multiple transformations. So if you don't have that capability, you're not going to be around. Next slide, please. So tech firms, of course, because the technology space is so riddled with uncertainty and opportunity, they have to have strong dynamic capabilities. And it's no longer just about new algorithms, it's about data. The new resource is big data, and understanding what data to store for how long is a capability. And knowing when and how to leverage that data is part of what dynamic capabilities is all about. So as you look at the big tech firms transforming with great regularity, and the nature of competitive advantage is changing, and data is increasingly important as they go across multiple industry segments. Next slide, please. So here's something I'll just finish on, and it's about Europe. Europe and the EU today constantly struggle with how does Europe, you know, stay ahead, and it doesn't have the productivity growth that North America has. It doesn't have the productivity growth that China has. Part of it, I submit, and this is Jean-Jacques Savin-Scribert, a French politician 50 plus years ago, saying what Europe needs is the ability to transform an idea into reality through the talent for coordinating skills and making rigid organizations flexible. That's exactly what dynamic capabilities is. So he's appealing. The concept wasn't there, the framework wasn't there, but he's appealing back then for European firms to have stronger dynamic capabilities. And I submit today that you could say the same thing. European firms have not really contributed to the rise of the technology sector in significant ways, have not been able to transform. And because of that, they're left out of a lot of digital transformation that's taking place. And you see Europe experimenting with the Digital Markets Act. In my view, that won't be successful. They've misdiagnosed their problem. It's not the monopoly problem. It's not monopoly power issues. It's a lack of strong entrepreneurial ecosystems and innovation systems that's hobbling Europe. Next slide, please. I think we want to move on. Next slide, please. Let's talk about related paradigms, and I have 10 minutes to do this. I started by saying that dynamic capabilities is a kind of a meta theory or a meta framework. You might even think about it as a workable systems theory. You know, in the academic world, we love to put things in silos because it makes life easier and it makes it possible to understand a domain of knowledge and to measure who's ahead and who's behind. But real problems, real world problems, in particular managerial problems, don't organize themselves into silos at all. Most big messy problems cut across multiple silos. So let me now explore some of the work that's been done in the academic world that I think fits into the dynamic capabilities framework, or at least, can benefit from being positioned alongside other frameworks and paradigms. Next slide, please. So to begin with, dynamic capabilities, I put to you, is not a theory, but a framework. And it can integrate knowledge management, leadership, marketing, operations management, organization behavior, and, well, it probably is complexity theory. It is a version of complexity theory. So clearly, to tackle real world problems, we need to integrate all these different elements. And the tools that dynamic capabilities can rely on include business models, decision analysis, economic analysis, entrepreneurship, finance. All of these tools are useful, but they have to be understood in an integrated way, and they have to be aligned in order to produce results. Next slide, please. So here are some of the different ideas that all of you are familiar with. You go to any airport bookstore in London, Paris, or Moscow, you can probably find, at least you could find, books on disruption, on the lean startup, on open innovation, on obliquity, on simple rules. There's many, many different paradigms that us academics dish up to the world. But you won't find a single book that tries to pull them all together. That's what dynamic capabilities tries to do. And I'll just, in the next 10 minutes that I have left here, I'll just indicate give you some hints as to how this is possible. So let's go to the next slide, please. All of you are familiar with Clay Christensen's work on disruption. And this is really a story about how smaller companies with few resources really end up tackling incumbents. Another way of putting what Clay is saying is that, companies that have weak sensing and sense making are vulnerable. So it's really just part of the fact that incumbents frequently don't have dynamic capabilities. And that's what leads to disruption. I'm not saying that having dynamic capabilities will necessarily protect you from disruption, but at least give you a fighting chance. Next slide, please. Now, of course, the Christensen framework has a number of assumptions in it. He says that disruption can only start at the low end, but there's no reason why it couldn't also start at the high end, and companies can go down from high price points to low price points. And he defines Netflix as a disruptor, but also somehow or other Uber is not. So what are the implications of all of this? I think the primary implications are that you need strong sensing in order to be prepared for disruption. And the best way to respond to disruption from new technologies is with strong dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. That's not to say there's not value in this framework. I think it helps embellish an understanding of why incumbents sometimes are slow at changing. It highlights the importance of business model design, and it's a warning against segmenting your notion of market and thinking that different industries don't compete. In today's world, companies don't stay in their own swim lanes anymore. In the technology space, Apple is competing with Amazon, which is competing with Netflix, which is competing with Disney. There aren't any defined industry boundaries. There aren't defined swim lanes in which channels competition. Competition can go in many, many different and new and unexpected ways. That's the nature of uncertainty. That's why you need to be on high alert. That's why, as Andy Grove, the CEO of Intel, once said, only the paranoid survive. You've got to be paranoid as a manager because you don't know where competition is going to come from. It's not, if you're Pepsi, it's not just coming from Coke. It may come from a completely new company that enters with organic foods or organic beverages that takes your market away, not necessarily overnight, but over a decade-long period. Next slide, please. Then there's a very popular concept called lean startup. And most entrepreneurs are very familiar with this. And this is about how small companies get started. And it's the unplanning view of startups. Once the lean startup framework became popular, most business schools dropped the idea of a business plan because the lean startup idea is forget about the business plan. There's so much uncertainty. Plans are irrelevant because they're going to be out of sync and they're going to be out of tune as soon as they're finished. So the emphasis should be on learning and being able to change, being able to sense and seize, this constant dichotomy of sensing and seizing. And that's really a form of dynamic capabilities, although because it's played out in the small company context, there's not much talk about transformation because a startup of 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 people, or maybe 200 people, doesn't have to be transformed very much because it's unlikely to be all that bureaucratic. So the early elements of dynamic capabilities, the sensing and seizing, is pretty much what lean startup is all about. Next slide, please. And here is Eric Ries. And listen to what he says. I've come to believe that learning is the essential unit of progress for startups. The effort that is not absolutely necessary for learning what customers want can be eliminated. So to him, it's about learning what customers want. I call this validated learning. Well, that's pretty much what abductive reasoning is all about. This is a key element of, dynamic capabilities too. And so here you have a very, very concrete and practical operationalization of dynamic capabilities for small companies. But this notion of quickly being able to change, if you're Boeing or you're Airbus and you're halfway through the design of a new superliner, you're not going to be able to change at low cost. So I think his framework is particularly adept for the software sector, but perhaps not for hardware. Next slide, please. Next slide. We're going to skip a few because I'm almost out of time. And so what Rees says, look, being efficient pretty much doesn't matter if you're a startup. What matters is being able to manage under deep uncertainty. A lot is happening simultaneously. You're acquiring new customers, you're servicing existing ones, you're raising capital, you're building capabilities, you're trying to improve the product, you're improving operations, you're deciding if and when to pivot. There's almost nothing in there about being efficient. You don't have time to worry about efficiency when you're in the early stages of developing a new product, where, of course, if it's truly new, the price points are going to be such that whoever wins and loses isn't going to be the most efficient. It's going to be the company that configures the product the right way for the future. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We'll skip a few here. Open innovation. I mentioned this before. This is my colleague, Henry Chesborough from Berkeley. And he emphasizes the fact that companies have got to be looking on the outside, not just looking at what's going on in their own research and development, but there's a lot of technology that's available through licensing or even through reading published patents. There's all kinds of ways in today's world to learn about what your competitors are up to. And as Henry says, you can't assume that all the smart people work in your company. So a lot of smart people, in fact, most smart people are not at your company, they're at somebody else's company. So figuring out how to, through partnerships or through licensing or through other forms of collaboration, innovate through the open innovation model is a critical way to bring on dynamic capabilities. Next slide, please. Yeah, we're going to skip. Let's skip. We're almost completely out of time. If I can just skip to the very last slide. The very last slide in the pack. So we're at 72. If we can skip all the way to, let's see, to 97, if you don't mind. Yeah, let's skip all the way to slide 97. Where I basically say, listen, the future of management science now has to be systems thinking. And the world is too complex to be understood in anything less than a system. An ecosystem is a good starting place. And you need a framework that can help you grapple with systems effects. And that's what dynamic capabilities is. Dynamic capabilities coupled with a validated strategy enables an organization to change in a manner that supports evolutionary fitness and sustainable advantage. That's my concluding proposition. There's huge avenues for research here, but it's also relevant for practice. It's what the great firms that are leading in the world of technology are doing. And it's up to us researchers to understand it better and to diffuse that knowledge and learning around the world. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, David, thank you very, very much. We already got quite a number of questions from the audience. But let me ask your permission first for using this presentation for the materials of the conference, if you don't mind, so that we can share this presentation with those who are interested. Is that okay with you?
Happy to have the conference participants have the slides.
Great, David. Thank you very much. Now, let me start with taking a few questions. There are really many of them from YouTube. Let me start with this one. Dear Professor Tisa, thank you for such an inspirational talk. Am I right saying that dynamic capabilities are relevant even for traditional industries, for example, power energy, in the view of liberalization and new tech?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, traditional industries, particularly in the electricity sector, at least in Western Europe and the United States, but also in China, are being shaken up by, of course, alternative fuels, wind, solar, and entirely different regulatory mandates as well. So I would say they're a bullseye for needing dynamic capabilities. Sadly, very few of them have it, and so they're very much like deer in the headlights. They don't know how to deal with these changes, and they need leaders who can think differently and be entrepreneurial, because it's also opportunity rich. Yes, at one point, if you've got a bunch of fixed assets that are set for yesterday's world, there's vulnerability, but there's also opportunity, and you've got to see both.
Thank you. Next, thank you so much for an insightful talk, Professor Tisa. Basing on the given arguments, could we argue that dynamic capabilities go beyond the boundary of a given firm, but should rather be assessed from an ecosystem perspective?
Well, yes, and most strong ecosystems, of course, have a dominant firm, or what I call an ecosystem captain. I mean, Android, has Google. If you're talking about mobile phones, of course, the Apple has its own ecosystem. And yes, the ecosystem has to be managed in some sense, in a cooperative sense, quite frankly, not in an autocratic sense, but in a cooperative sense. And if it doesn't have the ability to adjust and to reconfigure, that ecosystem is going to lose out to another ecosystem, assuming there's competition, of course. So absolutely, yes, we have to think about these concepts. I mean, dynamic capabilities is very much about the organization connecting with other organizations. The internal and the external are critical parts of it. So, and also, you know, being able to work with the regulatory environment. I mean, I'm looking at big tech firms in America who really are not at all skilled in working on public policy questions, and they're stumbling around. They need a new set of capabilities. And if they don't get them, they'll be in deep trouble.
Yes, David, thank you. There were two questions, the first two anonymous, and now we have a question from Professor Željko Tekić from our business school, and he has the following question. Thank you very much for this great lecture. Using dynamic capabilities framework, could you comment or predict how business schools should change and what are new dynamic capabilities they have to develop?
Yes, I went back recently and read the first issue, the first volumes of the journal Management Science back in the 50s. And management science actually aspired to kind of be a systems framework of some kind. But systems theory didn't really go very far. No one figured out how to operationalize it. And so academics then fell back into their silos of operations research, economics, statistics, and so forth. I think business schools have to once again attempt to master complexity theory or systems theory, and at least try and integrate all the different subfields of business. The reality is, and I'll say this even at my own business school, we don't do a good job at it. I mean, I like to joke that we teach students individual functional areas of marketing, management science, accounting, and we toss them out onto the street and tell them they've got to figure out how this works together because the faculty really doesn't know. And there's some truth to that. The challenge is that to understand dynamic capabilities, you've got to understand marketing, you've got to understand organizational behavior, you've got to understand economics, you've got to understand behavioral psychology. There's about 16 different subfields of the social sciences you have to master in some fashion. You don't have to master it down to the last detail, but you have to understand how those different fields relate and how they fit together. And we've not done a good job at that.
Yeah, thank you, David. Now let me turn to the colleagues who are in Microsoft Teams format. And I see already a few hands raised. Let me give the floor to Professor Sergey Filonovich from our business school. I understand he has a question. Sergey,
yes.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tis, for your wonderful presentation. At one of your slides, you shown that the entrepreneurial leadership cannot be implemented by one person. And that's quite easy to understand because it's very difficult for one person to sense, seize, and transform at the time. So it must be done by the team. What do you think are the most important qualities of such teams?
Well, one, it must be cohesive. Two, it must be infused with a culture of not just accepting change, but being willing to promote change and wanting to innovate. So wanting to be not like everybody else, but wanting to stand out, not stand out in a way that's worse, but stand out in a way that's better. So there's a certain mindset about challenging the way things have always been done. And that's sort of part of what an entrepreneurial mindset is. Now, of course, in large organizations, it's very hard to keep that entrepreneurial mindset and want to challenge all the time because you have so much that's already in place, and you'll get overwhelmed by so much that's in place. And so I think it means that sometimes you have to create new organizational units. I mean, that's what IBM did to create the PC, create a wholly new organizational unit and spin it out, and then maybe bring it back in at some point. So, you know, the culture, the attitudes, the state of mind are as important as the actual skill set of the top management team. I know that's an inadequate answer, but there's a piece in the California Management Review on dynamic capabilities and leadership. I'll be happy to send to you if you write me.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Now I see the hand raised from Professor Vitaly Tambovtsev from Moscow State University. Professor Tambovtsev, please.
Thank you. My question is very simple. What do you think? Are dynamic capabilities compatible with influence activities that exist in any organization?
With influence activities, well, depends on the nature of the influence activities. If they're entrepreneurial, then I would say it's good. But if it's very much focused on the individual interests of particular constituencies, and that's not aligned with a longer term vision and goals that are necessary, then you know, the influence activities can drag you down. So they can lift you up or drag you down, depending on what kind of motive is behind it.
Thank you.
Okay, now I see the hand raised from Professor Georgy Kleiner, the member of Russian Academy of Sciences. Georgy Borisovich, please.
Спасибо большое, профессор Тис.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. We know that you have been dealing with this issue for more than 20 years, well, 25 years, and we're using your work in our activity. And what you have said is really very important. But today, from your presentation, we have understood some more new things. Well, the traditional structure of the company is based on two aspects: management board, the board of directors. Well, what is the traditional system of management in companies? And stakeholders have different interests. Shareholders want to have income, managers want to have operational efficiency, and what body should be responsible? What body should be responsible for the development and for these dynamic capabilities?
Well, very good question. And I do want to emphasize the importance of boards of directors. If managers are not supported in the manner that we've described here, if boards are not supportive, then boards can kill and shackle leaders whose instincts are to be entrepreneurial. And in fact, to be honest, if I look at the firms that have got the strongest dynamic capabilities, most of them are founder-led. In other words, the founder is still in charge or has a significant share of stock, so that the shareholders, you know, as a group, you know, can't tell them what to do. In other words, you want to vest the CEO with a fair amount of authority, but at the same time, you want to make sure that the CEO has got an interest that's aligned with the relevant stakeholders. And so boards of directors are critical. In fact, that's the next area of my research, is to show what kind of boards you need in order to allow managers to have strong dynamic capabilities or to express them. Because particularly on risk issues, you know, we're appointing people to boards of directors that always say, oh, we don't want to take any risk that, you know, we don't want something to go wrong. But of course, you say no to too many things, and then you end up destroying the company's future. So you know, managing risk aversion in a way that is responsible and has the long-term perspective in mind
is important. So it's not just about the top management team, it's also about the board of directors.
Okay, thank you, David. Professor Anna Veselova from our business school as well. Please, Anna.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for this insightful and inspiring talk. And I have a question related to the thing that you spoke about at the very beginning, related to the uncertainty of the external environment and actually the increased pace of the changes in the external environment. If we consider the three dimensions of dynamic capabilities, sensing, seizing, and transformation, so sensing and seizing could be addressed with ambidexterity concept. But what can we do with transformation, both conceptual and practically? So transformation usually requires time. That's most of the firms actually don't have now, or at least they have less time to do this.
Well, by the way, I'm not sure I agree that ambidexterity deals to the sensing and seizing. There's no strategy inside of ambidexterity, and I didn't have much time to develop it. But if you don't have strategy, you know, being agile and being ambidextrous, but for what? You've got to figure out where you're going to place your bets. And so it's not enough to say, I've got to be ambidextrous. Yes, you have to be. That's necessary. It's not sufficient. Now, transformation, you know, the existing organization will often stand in the way of being ambidextrous. You know, maybe you can break off and start new entities, but if you're not able to reshape the organization and transform it, then, you know, your ambidexterity will be dragged down as well. So I think you still need the transformation story and you need the strategy story. But having said that, one of the related paradigms is ambidexterity. I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but my good friend Charles O'Reilly is and I are talking about actually writing a piece on ambidexterity and dynamic capabilities to try and bring those two frameworks closer together.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. Also, I see the hand from one of our doctoral students, Anastasia Nedelka. Nastya, please, the floor is yours.
Dear Professor Tis, thank you so much for an interesting presentation. It is a pleasure to meet you here and learn more about dynamic capabilities as a new mental model of the 21st century. So my question is about environmental circumstances. In the presentation, you mentioned the examples of developed countries, while Russia is still developing one. So how do you think, do Russian companies which compete on Russian developing market need just to copy the dynamic capabilities of those companies which work on developed markets, or do they need to adapt existing best practices somehow?
Well, you raise a very good question, and indeed, you know, as I said, you do need a certain level of best practices, but one shouldn't be blindsided into believing that all you have to do is get to best practices and you'll succeed. So I think with respect to developing countries, one, if you've got strong dynamic capabilities, you can leapfrog, you know, sensing the future and figuring out that the evolutionary path, that's indeed possible. But secondly, I think in many developing environments, you have to work closely with government, and the dynamic capabilities framework allows you to think about the broader ecosystem. And you know, it's not just all about managers doing their little private sector thing. It's about building coalitions and political deals, if you will, with government to advance. So part of managing the broader ecosystem is also managing the regulatory environment. You know, I've got a chapter I'm doing for a book on sort of dynamic capabilities and economic development. If you write me, I'd be happy to send that to you. But I believe there's some relevance to the framework and thinking about countries that are still in the catch-up mode.
Thank you
David,
so much for the answer.
Now Now I'm switching back to YouTube questions which are coming on and on. Dear Professor Tisa, am I right that dynamic capabilities approach leads to dynamic KPIs, or it is a result of KPIs changing faster than before?
Yeah, well, remember the quote from Deming, which is, you can't be entirely metrics driven, but that's not to say you shouldn't have some metrics. I think innovation, metrics around innovation, around productivity, around improvement, and around new product launches are KPIs to monitor. But it's easy to get trapped by metrics, and a lot of traditional metrics are very much about efficient operations. And as I've said, that sometimes efficiency can be the enemy of innovation. So thinking about new KPIs is important, and balancing KPIs and understanding where they're helpful and when you gotta, in fact, have a symphony of different things to listen to, which include KPIs, but are not exclusively KPIs, is the way to go.
Yeah. David, the other question is the following. How does the concept of dynamic capabilities relate to the concept of strategic capabilities?
Well, strategy is an element of dynamic capabilities, but just being great at strategy, isn't going to get you a home run either. If you're good at strategy, then you won't waste opportunities. But first of all, you have to think through what the capabilities are and what the opportunities are. So I think strategic capabilities are necessarily have to be dynamic. So that are closely related ideas, but I don't think strategic capabilities is a framework that you can easily build other things into it, whereas dynamic capabilities has got enough headroom that you can, it's a meta theory, if you will, or a meta framework that can incorporate strategy, whereas it's not true the other way around.
Thanks, David. Well, another question is also partly on linking to other concepts. Dear Professor Tisa, I would appreciate your view on a link between a sustainability mindset and dynamic capabilities for the entrepreneurial manager. So,
yeah, well, there's two different definitions of sustainability. Sometimes I use the term sustainability to refer to durability of the enterprise. And sometimes sustainability is used in an environmental sense to talk about environmental sustainability. I do think you have to have a multi-stakeholder view of the enterprise. And I do think, at least in Western Europe, the United States, and many parts of the world today, the companies are having to pay a lot more attention to issues like global warming and what have you, and that kind of sustainability. And if you're a hydrocarbon company, if you're Exxon or if you're Saudi Aramco, you got to be thinking about these issues in a very major way. And I think the major oil companies are struggling to find this set of new capabilities to address not so much the changing business environment as the changing social and political environment. So this is what dynamic capabilities is about. It's about evolutionary fitness. It's getting away from, it's not about maximizing profits. If you start off trying to maximize profits, you never will. If you aim for evolutionary fitness, maybe you'll be profitable for a long period of time. So that's one way to think about this.
Thank you, David. And maybe the final question, which also goes to the core of your concept. Where are the sources of dynamic capabilities? As I've got from your examples, we connect dynamic capabilities with top managers or their teams. They push companies to change and give ideas. they look like the source or the driver of dynamic capabilities. Is it so every time, or we can find them any other way?
Well, first of all, I would say it's not just the top management team, it's the institutions and the environment and the broader innovation ecosystem that matters. I mean, when I'm thinking about Europe and the United States right now, and you know, I think Europe needs a much stronger sort of innovation focus, and organizations need to be less bureaucratic, and it needs more of an entrepreneurial mindset. Now, where does that come from? It doesn't just come from the identity of the managers, it's from the broader social environment as well. And I think China is much more entrepreneurial culture than Europe, for instance. And that's why, you know, Chinese companies, I think, got many cases of strong dynamic capabilities. And you see it in some American companies too. So the big question is, why is Europe left out? And I think it's because the entrepreneurial culture is not as alive in Europe as it is in China and in the United States. So yes, it's not just the top management team, it's the broader economic environment, the broader social environment, and the political environment, too.
Sure. And maybe the really final one from the floor, Professor Rybязина from HEC Business School. Please, Vera.
Dear Professor Tis, thank you very much for your insighting presentation. I have a question about dynamic capabilities and their influence on the marketing strategy of the company. So how do you think, what would be the importance from the marketing perspective? Thank you.
Yes, well, of course, at the end of the day, you know, it's markets that matter. And I would say dynamic capabilities is very much focused for the broader environment, and it sees the market not just in from the consumer point of view, but from a broader conceptual framework where it's looking at not just what consumers think they need today, but what they're going to need tomorrow, and the various social and political things which are impacting the consumers. So I think it's a broader view of marketing. I think many of the tools of marketing are relevant. I think a lot of the ways in which, you know, you can figure out market trends and so forth are useful as part of the sensing apparatus of a company with strong dynamic capabilities. But I think it says that from a competitive point of view, that, you know, there are no longer substitutes in one category and complements in another. Frequently, a company that's a complement today is a competitor tomorrow. So there's marketing and then there's markets. But I think what's different is that you don't know from where competition is going to come, and market boundaries don't matter anymore. So I think there's some elements of marketing framework that are relevant, but we have to think about markets in new ways and the role of big data and the fact that, you know, consumer behavioral data is now ubiquitously available and can be used across markets. That's what's different.
David, thank you very much again. Unfortunately, time goes too fast, and we are to resume our meeting and this session. Dear David, thank you very, very much again for this excellent presentation and very deep and open answers to the questions. Let me say that we have still a very long list of questions remained unanswered. And let me use this opportunity to invite you on behalf of the Higher School of Economics and its Graduate School of Business to visit us here in Moscow when pandemic regime permits. We would be really happy to have you with us and continue this very intense and rich dialogue on dynamic capabilities and its applications to various institutional regimes, markets, and countries.
Valerie, thank you. I'm very happy to publicly accept that invitation, and What excellent questions I've heard tonight. And if you, Valerie, wish to aggregate all those questions, I'll be happy to glance over them. And if I can put a sentence or two down or a clue or something, literature that would steer people in the right direction, I'll be happy to do so. It won't happen overnight, but if you give me that list, I'll be happy to have a shot at it.
David, thank you very much again. We had about 130 participants in this session today, from faculty and doctoral students, not only from Higher School of Economics, but from the Academy of Sciences and from other key Moscow universities and other cities as well, which are key academic centers in Russia. So this was really an important event intellectually and with great impact on the development of management studies in Russia. Thank you very much, David, again, and see you soon.
Very good.
Please,
thank you all.
Please stay healthy and safe. Goodbye.
Indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.